Today I will talk about the science behind my all-time favorite candy, which is licorice. And licorice is one of these things like Marmite or Brussels sprout. Either you love it or you hate it because it's quite an acquired taste. Now you've got many different variants. So this is some typical Dutch one. As you can tell, I quite like these because we've got a big bag of them. But we also have something which is in Dutch, which is what we call English licorice, which is a bit more sweet and looks like this. So let's have a little look at the history behind licorice. Licorice extract comes from the root of Glycyrrhiza glabra. I did have to look it up a few times to know how to pronounce it, but it's thought that this licorice extract has been used medicinally for over 4,000 years. So people kind of like, it's like a myth going on that the Egyptians used this and they were so much fan of it that one of the pharaohs was actually buried with a lot of licorice. Now, at the time, they didn't use it so much as a sweet. That didn't come later on, but they did use to brew it. And as you can tell, licorice also gives flavor to, for instance, teas or tobacco or lots of other things. So we mainly know it as a sweet, but then it would have the licorice extract and it's boiled up with sugar, flour, and gelatin. So that gives you like that kind of candy shape, whereas it's also a lot used in drinks. Now, I live in the UK. So there it was thought that it was first grown in Pontefract after it's being brought from the Middle East, because they have many regions of South Asia, maybe south of Europe, but also North Africa, where this plant can grow. Now, licorice extract is associated with a number of health benefits, or people, at least in traditional herbal medicine, are thought to associate it with health benefits, which include anti-inflammatory properties, but also antibacterial and antiviral properties. So it's been used for treatment of gastric ulcers, but also in certain liver diseases. Now, it's not all good because there is also some drawbacks associated with it. And there's also like an example found of licorice poisoning. But from what I found, you really, really need to eat a lot to actually get to the point. And even I would really, love my licorice. I can't cope with eating so much. So it does increase your blood pressure and is also associated with changes in potassium levels. But again, this comes in quite high quantities. Now, obviously, this is the licorice extract. If we talk about the candy, it's obviously processed with a lot of sugar. So in that sense, it's still like candy, so you can't have too much of it. Well, what is your typical licorice made of? If you look at the licorice extract, it's mainly composed of a particular acid, of which you can see the chemical structure here. So you see the acid groups on the top and also a few on the bottom. And that is actually 40 times sweeter than what we have on table sugar. So it tastes very sweet, but I think, as you might know, it's a different type of sweetness, which also lasts for a bit longer. So it is a very distinct flavor in that sense. But that's the actual licorice extract. If you form it into like the black candy that we know, it will have to have a sugar as well and some binder, which is typically starch or flour. Now you want it to look appealing as well, so you can add extra flavors to it. You can add extra things to it that give it a particular color. But you can have also beeswax, which can give it that kind of shiny approach. But another kind of common thing, and this is where you have the distinction between the sweets version of the licorice and the salty one. If you would go for the salty variant, you would add ammonium chloride to it, and I'll come back to it. And ammonium chloride really gives it a very, very salty flavor. And this can go up as high as 8%. Now, and you might be surprised that because this is quite an extreme flavor, but even in certain licorice, which is actually supposed to be tasting sweet, you would still have some ammonium chloride in there. So I've talked about the main component then in licorice, which gives it the flavor or the sweetness that we experience, but there's also like a very distinct smell that comes with it. And that's more associated with the volatile compounds that you have in there, like aroma compounds. So for instance, when you kind of smell wine and certain things, that's when you get like a flavor of these things. Now, I think we know there's aniseed in there because that's the kind of typical smell that people associate with licorice. And that's definitely true to an extent. But there's been extensive research recently which also showed that there are like a number of other flavor compounds, and they actually discovered like 60 new aromas. So in total, well, there's over 50 compounds, but they found that around 40 of them give it that very distinct kind of smell to it. So here you can kind of see that the flavor wheel, where you can see certain things that are important. So you see that the aniseed-like is definitely very strong, but it also has a bit of eucalyptus. It has like a kind of popcorn flavor, which you might find in certain other starchy compounds, and is a bit of like a smokiness to it as well, which might be quite surprising for you. So it's a very kind of balanced kind of. There are two particular compounds in there, which is the anethol and the estragol, which give it that aniseed-like smell. But imagine here that the smell would be very different between, your black candy or you having it kind of heated. So like in a flavor, like for instance, a tea or a coffee or something like that. So in that case, what you would see is that, so even the video I did on beer brewing, you would see that there are these different compounds in there, particularly aldehydes, that start to react and you start to get esterification. And these different reactions give it different flavors. So as soon as you start heating it, you get more of those that actually give it kind of like a caramel type of smell. So bearing in mind that this, when you put your nose into a bag of like your salty licorice versus you having it in a cup of tea, this will be quite different flavor. Now finally, like we've learned a little bit about like what's actually in there, and I talked about you can have licorice in all types of flavors, but the very big distinction is between the more like traditional sweet flavor, which you tend to have in Europe, or we call this licorice all sorts, or as I said, in the Netherlands, we call this English licorice, because for us it's kind of like, it's not exactly licorice, it's more sweet than anything else. And then we have the more salty version, which is much more popular in Scandinavia, and particularly in Finland, but also in the Netherlands. And this is more associated with what we call salmiak or salmiakki in Finland. And this is really an acquired flavor, which you've got to learn, I think, to eat when you're actually younger. Now, as I mentioned before, this is because it's got this ammonium chloride to it, which gives it a very distinct flavor. And you can even find this, you might be surprised, in chocolate and shakes. I've read that they even give it to meat and cakes. So very popular there. And I think the thing is behind it, and I do love it myself. The first bite you think like, oh, this is awful. The second bite you get used to it and you quite easily become addicted to it. And as I mentioned before, you get this typical flavor by adding ammonium chloride to it. Now, it's not very clear how this originated or why it's more popular, for instance, in the Netherlands and the north of Europe, but people seem to think that it's a bit similar to what you have in cough medicine. And you can imagine for kids, it's not really nice to have cough medicine, so having something kind of like sweet that goes with it makes it a lot more tolerable. So hopefully in this video I've learned a little bit more about the chemical compounds that you have in licorice, why I think it's good for you, as long as you don't eat too much. And in our playlist about the science of everyday things, you can find a bit more about other common things in your daily life that you use and the science behind it. Thanks for watching.